that it should be live now. Quick check. Yep. Okay, so we are moving on now to a sort of application of the question of paternalism to a particular issue, which I think is interesting, which is whether we should allow healthy people, healthy adults, to sell their organs, sell their kidneys, and that's what we'll be looking at both today and tomorrow. Today we'll be looking at some arguments against the market for kidneys, against legalizing the market for kidneys, and tomorrow we'll be looking at some arguments in favor of it. First, I wanted to take a look at the quiz results for the entrance quiz for Module 2. So we have some interesting results here. The first question about whether adults should be legally allowed to do whatever they want, even things that are potentially self-destructive, such as drug use, gambling, suicide, so long as they don't harm anyone else with their decisions. And this question is basically asking where you stand on paternalism generally. It was pretty close. 57% of you said that adults should be legally allowed to do anything as long as it's not harming anyone else. That is, 57% are rejecting paternalism. And the remaining 43% think that there are at least some cases where it's legitimate for the law to prohibit people from engaging in self-destructive behavior. So that's interesting that it's pretty close on people's intuitions or ideas before coming into the course, and it'll be interesting to see how that might change or might not change by the end of it. Question 2, should it be legal for healthy people to sell one of their kidneys to someone who needs it? I was quite surprised to find that the majority of you, 2/3 of you, said that it should be legal to sell one of your kidneys, and the remaining 1/3 said that you ought not to be able to do that. Question 3, individuals know better how to live their own lives and advance their own interests than do others. This was actually exactly even split, 1/3 into each of the answers. 1/3 said that yes, they do without any qualification. 1/3 said no, they don't, and 1/3 said only if they're well educated. So it's an interesting, we saw already that Mill and Dworkin disagreed on this to some extent, and it's interesting to see that we have a lot of disagreement in the class as well. And the fourth question was, adults should be allowed to make any voluntarily agreed to exchange between each other. There should be no legally established limits on how much per hour someone is allowed to work for, on prices for goods, or on conditions in the workplace. Whatever people voluntarily agree to should be allowed. And this, I was also pretty surprised that most of you disagreed with this. So 76% said that this is not the case, that we should have restrictions of this kind, and only 24% said that this should be allowed, that any voluntarily agreed to arrangement or exchange is permissible. It's interesting because we can see a significant divide between people's opinions on paternalism or what seems like paternalism anyway, when it comes to questions of choices like drug use, gambling, suicide, versus questions that are more in the economic realm, questions about wages and working conditions and things like that, prices. So, interesting results. Again, obviously no answers were right or wrong, this is just asking your opinion. Thanks for everyone who participated. So moving on now to Satz. So Deborah Satz is the author we're reading for today. And she starts by briefly running through some of the main reasons to favor allowing the sale of kidneys, even though she ultimately thinks that the market should at least be very regulated. She gives some reasons that you might think that it should be legal. And the first is just the basic economics of it. We have a problem in most countries throughout the world that there are more people who need kidneys than there are people willing to give up their kidneys. We need more kidneys than we have available. Now, the typical way to solve a problem like that in a market is to just raise the price of the good that we have a shortage of. So if we ended up with a shortage of apples, what we would do is we would increase the price of apples, and that would both lower the demand for apples and also raise the supply by encouraging people to engage in more production of apples. The same thing here, we would think with the market for kidneys. If we allow people to be paid for it, that is, we raise the price above zero, then we would expect that more people would be willing to donate a kidney. So that's the economic sort of argument. There's also an argument from freedom. There's an argument that people have a right to do whatever they want with their bodies, and if they want to sell a kidney, then they should be permitted to do so. Now, as we saw, some people think that there's a big difference between being allowed to do whatever you want with your body and being allowed to make any sort of exchange that you want. And this is more in the realm of exchange because you already are allowed to donate your kidney for whatever reason. You don't have to be related to anyone. You can donate it to someone unrelated to you. But you can't do it for money. So this is the question that really we're struggling with here is the economic question. Should you be allowed to do it for money? And the final argument is one about the lives that we'll save. We'll save a lot of lives by increasing the supply of kidneys, and that has pretty significant value. Not only are we going to save a lot of lives, we'll also improve a lot of lives, get people off dialysis machines, and able to live fuller, richer lives. So those are the sort of core arguments in favor of allowing a market for kidneys. Sats then goes over some of the facts about kidney sales today. It's banned nearly everywhere. There's almost nowhere in the world, although we'll talk about one exception a little bit later, that you're allowed to sell your kidney. Altruistic donation is pretty much the only option in most places. Also, donation after death, which is a form of altruistic donation since you're not allowed to be paid for that either. So that's really the only option in most of the world, and the result of that is that there are very long lines for kidney transplants. Most people who need a kidney transplant will not get one, at least in the first year that they need it, and perhaps at all. So Sats then goes into an analysis of whether a market for kidneys would actually help. So she provides some evidence, some reasons to think that it wouldn't even increase the supply of kidneys. So she has some data from some research about blood donations and some other related sort of cases where putting something in the context of a commodity or in the context of a market changes people's feelings towards it such that altruistic donation or altruistic behavior goes down significantly. And so there could be a worry that if we open up a market for kidneys, then altruistic donation will go down so far and the people who are willing to sell their kidney won't make up for it. So we'll end up with less kidneys overall. She says, a priori, that is, before we actually have any empirical evidence, we can't know for certain whether a market for kidneys would actually serve the function of increasing the supply of kidneys. But, and this is something Sats doesn't talk about, but we do have one example one case of a country that has adopted a market for kidneys, and this is, somewhat surprisingly, I guess, Iran. Iran has had a market for kidneys for, I think, a couple decades now. I'm not sure the exact timeline, but they've had a lot of success in increasing the supply of available kidneys for transplant. And around 4/5 of those that are available for transplant come from living non-relatives, primarily people, that is, who are being paid to give their kidney up for transplant. So it seems that at least in that one case, it did work. It increased the supply of kidneys significantly, and the lines in Iran for kidneys are much smaller than they would be otherwise. Now, whether it's completely eliminated the lines, I'm not sure. I don't know enough about the case to say. You could look into it if you're interested. But it is one example of a case where it seems like a market for kidneys has worked, in the sense that it has increased the availability of kidneys to people who need them. So, moving from here, SATS is sort of putting aside the question of whether this will actually work or not. And by work, I mean increase the supply of kidneys. There are a variety of arguments that you can give against the market for kidneys which aren't based on this question of whether or not they'll increase the supply, because there are other considerations that are important, and SATS goes into these. So the first argument has to do with vulnerability. So the worry is that poor people and people who are in desperate need of money are going to be exploited by this market for kidneys, and we're going to end up with them engaging in organ sales that aren't ultimately beneficial to them. It's just they're in such desperate straits right now that it seems to them like the right decision. And so there's this worry about taking advantage of vulnerable people. So that's the first sort of argument. SATS doesn't spend a lot of time on it. It's pretty clear how exactly that's supposed to work. She does mention that defenders of the market for kidneys could point out the possibility of using regulation to help solve this problem. So we could imagine a number of different regulatory schemes which might lessen this problem to some significant extent. Likewise, although SATS doesn't really consider this, the defenders might follow Mill and say something like, people pretty much know what's best for them most of the time, and a poor person, even a desperately poor person, is not stupid. And if they judge that tens of thousands of dollars in exchange for an organ that you can give up without really any significant health consequences in most cases, might be worth it in their circumstance. And we, as people who don't know their situation intimately, are really not in a position to judge whether that was worth it for them or not. And if it is worth it for them, then we're not only depriving someone of a kidney, which could save their life or drastically improve their life, but we're also depriving a poor person of a way to perhaps climb out of poverty, or at least provide a much higher standard of living than they would otherwise be able to get. So that's a sort of consideration that a defender could bring up as well on this vulnerability point. So the next argument that you might have against a market for kidneys that SATS discusses is, she calls it weak agency. And the idea here is that people can't be really adequately informed. Well, there are a couple ideas, but the first is that people can't really be adequately informed of the factors relevant to their decision until long after it's made. The health consequences of donating a kidney are potentially quite negative. It's rare in wealthy countries that a kidney donor will end up with serious health consequences, but it's more common in poor ones. So SAT's talking about the case of India, where a lot of black market kidney transplants occur. In that case, it's often true that there are some negative health consequences to donating a kidney. It's also possible, and this is a second kind of weak agency, that in some cultures, some people may be pressured into kidney sales without really getting their full consent. So she, again, is talking about the case of India, where married women often can be pressured by their spouses into doing things which they may not actually want to do. And so if we allow the sale of organs, this could be just another case of that, and potentially a very serious one. So Satz gives a couple possible responses that defenders could make. And Satz, I should just say, Satz is really doing an excellent job here as far as writing philosophy in a honest and critical way. So she's not only presenting her side of the argument, but also considering what people on the other side might say. And so there are a couple possible responses. The first is that we require education of those who are going to donate kidneys so that we can give them more information about the potential health consequences. The second point that defenders might make is that these weak agency objections apply just as well to altruistic donations. So people don't have full information when they're making a donation altruistically, when they're doing it for a family member or a friend, or just as a person who wants to help out someone else. And they also have a lot of pressure, especially if it's a close family member or friend, from their family, from their social group, to donate their kidney to someone who needs it in that sort of case. So the weak agency objection seems to cut across both the market for kidneys and altruistic donations. And of course, we wouldn't want to rule out any kidney donation whatsoever. So if this objection holds, then it seems like it would over-apply, and not the problem. It's also, so a third argument that defenders could make is that we allow people to work in a number of very risky professions. We allow them to engage in risky behavior. So why is this case so special? Why is it the case that sales for kidneys are supposed to be especially regulated when we allow people to be coal miners, we allow people to be truckers, we allow people to engage in all sorts of very dangerous professions in exchange for money. We allow people to skydive. We allow people to go mountain climbing. These are activities that they don't even get paid for. They just think it enriches their lives. So why would it be that we can make an argument against kidney sales when we can't prohibit these other things? Right? So that's another thing to think about. So the next argument that Satz makes is an equal status consideration. So the argument here is that allowing kidney sales will predictably mean that the poor are going to be selling their kidneys to the rich. The rich are going to be the ones getting the transplants, and the poor are going to be the ones providing the organs. Alternatively, you could think of this as someone who's relatively low status is going to be providing the organs, and someone relatively high status is going to be receiving them. So, whereas in altruistic market, we see much more equal distribution of donors because it's generally close personal relations, which often follow these sort of which cut across all the different sort of low and high status groups. In a market for kidneys, we would expect that the lower status and poorer people would be the ones giving up the organs most of the time. So defenders can reply, as Satz suggests, that there are lots of markets that work this way. You don't see many rich people who are coal miners, but you see many rich consumers of coal. You don't see many rich people who are janitors, but you see lots of rich people employing janitors, employing the services of janitors. So there's nothing inherently wrong with there being a division between what rich people do, what poor people do in their jobs, in their means of making a living, as long as there's proper compensation, right? As long as the compensation is reasonable, as long as the people providing the service agree to do it and see it as their best option, it's totally permissible in lots of areas for this to be the case. But critics, Seth says, can raise concerns about kidney markets worsening inequality, because it's just one more thing that the wealthy have access to that the poor don't. So, again, in a market for kidneys, we would expect that the rich are primarily the recipients, not just because they wouldn't typically be donors since they don't need the money, but also they're the ones with the money to afford the transplants, to afford both the fees from doctors and also buying the kidney itself. But this reasoning, you might think, could cut against a lot more than organ sales. So any sort of new technology tends to do this. When smartphones first came out, they were in the domain primarily of the rich, but now they've extended to nearly everyone. So this sort of problem is one which cuts across a lot of different areas, and this is another argument that defenders could make. SAT suggests that also defenders could again appeal to the possibility of regulation. There are various regulatory schemes that we might come up with, or institutions which could lessen this problem of unequal status or equal status considerations, speaking against the market for kidneys. So the last kind of argument that Satz brings up is what she calls integrity of the body, right? And the concern here is that once kidneys and other organs become marketable, it changes the choices not only of those who wish to engage in the market, but also those who don't. So that is, it doesn't simply add choices, but it changes everyone's choices. It doesn't just add choices to the people who might be interested in selling their kidneys. So an example she gives is if you're not willing to, say, put your kidney up as collateral for a loan, right? So when we think about collateral for a loan, we typically think of our houses, our cars. Those are our main assets. But a kidney could be a very expensive and very high-value commodity. So it's another thing that lenders might want as collateral. But the question here is if we ought to make it the case that people who aren't willing to give up their kidney for whatever reason are disadvantaged as a result of that. So there's only so much money to go around as far as loans go, and the people who are willing to put up less collateral are going to systematically get less loans than people who are willing to put up more collateral. So the thought is it right, is it fair to make it the case that some people will lose opportunities due to their unwillingness to sell their kidneys? And Sat's thought here is that kidneys are different from cars and houses in that our bodies are a thing that a lot of people think should be inviolate in some way. They shouldn't be up for sale. They shouldn't be up for the same sort of procedures or the same sort of thinking of them as social resources that our external property might. And so they just shouldn't be treated similarly to cars and houses. They should be treated with a different kind of respect, a different kind of reverence, I guess, for our body, where we have much more control over what happens to it. And we shouldn't be expected to give up any of that control in order to gain some advantage. So that's the sort of integrity of body argument. At the end, Satz ends by giving us a little chart of what she thinks the relevant issues are and how some of the proposed institutions stack up with regard to them. And she concludes from this, you can look at the chart for yourself, that a true market for kidneys, treating kidneys just like any other external piece of property that we might have, is going to fare too poorly, according to her, on the considerations she brings up to be morally acceptable. Now, it sounds like she might be more willing to consider some sort of very regulated market for kidneys, but it might be that she thinks that any market for kidneys is a problem. It's not entirely clear, I don't think, from the text. But in any case, what she's saying is that a true or pure market for kidneys she thinks is morally unacceptable for the sort of reasons that we just went through. So this is something for you to consider. There's also a consideration when it comes to regulated markets or altruistic markets, the other side of it, which is the questions about the supply of kidneys, right? There might be a lot of moral problems with the market for kidneys, but it can't be compared against a situation where we have just as many kidneys without all those moral problems, because the point of the pure market for kidneys would be to increase to the greatest extent the supply of kidneys available for transplant to people who need it. So that's something to consider, and something that we'll be talking about quite a bit tomorrow. Okay, so that's it. For those of you who are watching live, feel free to ask questions right away. Anyone else, you can email me or post on D2L. I'll wait a little bit for questions, but while I'm waiting, let me talk a little bit about the exam. So I haven't looked at the exams yet, so I don't know how anyone did on them. I plan to have them all graded by the end of tonight and post them before, post the grades before lecture tomorrow. Saying a little bit about the grading, just for clarity's sake, I'm going to put up two different grades on D2L. One is your multiple choice portion, and one is the essay portion, just so it's clear which part is which. The total is still going to be the same as far as the effect on your grade. Yeah, so I'll try to get those up as soon as I can get them all graded. If you want detailed comments about your essay, I'd be happy to give them to you. You can email me and I will give you those comments. If you don't email me, I am going to tend to not give any sort of detailed comments. Tomorrow I will tomorrow or Friday, probably Friday, because that'll be the review session and we'll want to talk about strategies for success on future exams. So probably Friday I will go through some of the biggest issues in the essay. If for people who did poorly on the essay portion, I'll go through like what the primary problems were in all of the essays generally, and we can talk through that, and it'll give you some idea, some better idea of what exactly I'm looking for. Yeah, I think that's it for now. Not seeing any questions right just yet. I'll wait just another minute and then I will close if I don't get any. Okay, looks like there aren't any, so I will stop it here. Again, feel free to email me or post on D2L any questions that you have, and I will see you tomorrow.